The hall trembled with the kind of anticipation that makes your heartbeat echo louder than the music. Cameras blinked like unblinking eyes, rows of faces shimmering under white, hot lights. Backstage, Jonathan Roumie stood still, his reflection fractured in the mirror before him. The applause on the other side of the curtain wasn't comforting. It was a countdown. Every cheer tightened his chest. Every flash of light felt like judgment. He had been invited to speak about faith, about unity, about the quiet courage to stand for truth. But tonight, truth felt heavy, like a blade in his hand. He had heard things, rumors, whispers about pride and manipulation surrounding Charlie Kirk. Things that didn't sit right. He wanted to believe they were lies, but somewhere in his soul, an unease had begun to burn. He thought about the country, how divided it had become, how easily people turned faith into performance, compassion into currency. Charlie was the golden voice of that movement, confident, untouchable, adored. And yet, behind that smile, Jonathan sensed something hollow. He couldn't name it, but it called to him, daring him to confront it. He closed his eyes and prayed, though the prayer came out as more of a whisper than a plea. God, give me words that don't wound, but also don't lie. His palms were sweating. His heart didn't feel righteous, it felt restless. From the stage came the announcement, his name, louder than he expected. The curtain parted, and light exploded across his face. Thousands of eyes turned toward him. Applause crashed over the room like thunder, but he didn't raise his hand to wave. He stepped forward slowly, steadying his breath. The podium waited. Charlie sat across the stage, still, smiling politely, his gaze sharp as glass. Jonathan could feel the clash before a word was spoken. Two men, two truths, two versions of faith about to collide. He gripped the microphone. The noise quieted. His voice came low, trembling slightly. There are moments in life when the truth feels like fire, he began, and sometimes that fire doesn't just reveal. It burns. The crowd leaned in. His eyes found Charlie's. But the truth that broke me that night didn't come from a man, it came from a child. The applause rolled like thunder, but Jonathan didn't hear it. He only heard the drumbeat of his own pulse, the rush of something fierce rising in his chest. The microphone felt heavy in his hand, as if it carried the weight of everything he hadn't said until this moment. He smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady, practiced. "Tonight, I want to talk about conviction, about standing up for what's right, even when it's hard." The audience responded with another wave of applause, but his words came out sharper than intended, slicing through the noise like tempered glass. He walked slowly across the stage, the lights catching the sheen of sweat on his brow. "Faith," he said, pausing just long enough for silence to settle, "isn't a weapon. It's not a banner to march behind, or a sword to strike others with. Faith is supposed to heal." A murmur rippled through the room, agreement, maybe discomfort. Jonathan could feel it, the tension, the unspoken fear that someone might be the target of what he was saying. Charlie's face flickered on the big screen above them, calm, unreadable, his smile tight as armor. Jonathan continued, but something in his tone shifted. "We talk about defending truth, but how many of us defend our pride instead? How many of us stand tall, not out of courage, but out of fear? Fear of being wrong, fear of being seen." He looked down for a moment, his throat tight. The words were meant for the audience, but they landed squarely inside his own chest. He felt it. The contradiction, the mirror he had built for others now reflecting back at him. He was angry, not just at Charlie, but at the way pride had found its way into every pulpit, every podium, every platform, including his own. Charlie's expression didn't change, but his stillness spoke louder than any rebuttal. Cameras flashed, freezing the tension mid-breath. Jonathan caught his reflection in the teleprompter, eyes fierce, jaw locked, and for a heartbeat, he didn't recognize the man staring back. He raised his voice, trying to drown out that doubt. "Truth without love," he said, "is just noise." The crowd reacted, some nodding, others uneasy. He could feel them shifting, sensing something deeper than words. His voice trembled, but not from nerves, from conviction wrestling with ego. He turned toward Charlie, though he didn't call his name. "We build platforms so tall," he said, "that we start mistaking the height for holiness." A pause. A single cough echoed from the back of the room. "But tell me, what good is preaching about humility if we can't practice it when the spotlight hits?" Charlie's eyes flicked toward him. 1 second of contact that felt like a spark near dry wood. The audience didn't breathe. Jonathan knew he was teetering on the edge, caught between revelation and accusation. Inside, something cracked. He thought he was angry at Charlie, but it wasn't that simple. He was angry at himself, for letting frustration masquerade as passion, for letting righteousness turn to rage. Yet even in that anger, he couldn't stop. "I came here tonight," he said, his voice lower now, trembling, "to speak truth. But maybe truth isn't what we say, it's what we're willing to admit." A faint sigh rolled through the crowd, the kind that carries both awe and discomfort. Jonathan's heart pounded as if begging him to stop, to breathe, but the words kept coming. He looked down at the floor, then back to the audience, and for a moment, his eyes softened. "I thought I was here to teach a lesson," he said quietly, the microphone barely catching the sound. "I didn't know I was about to learn one." The air inside the hall had changed. The applause that once filled the room was gone, replaced by the kind of silence that carries both awe and fear. Jonathan stood at the podium, his chest rising and falling like a man standing before a storm he'd summoned himself. "Freedom without humility," he said, his voice deep, measured, "isn't freedom at all. It's chaos dressed up as courage." The audience stirred, heads turning, cameras shifting to capture every flicker of emotion. "And truth," he continued, "without love becomes nothing but noise." He let the words hang there, heavy and cutting. Somewhere in the second row, a woman nodded through tears. But Jonathan wasn't finished. He looked across the stage at Charlie Kirk, sitting tall, still smiling, though the edges of that smile had begun to tremble. Charlie's jaw tightened, just slightly, but the cameras caught it. It was the first visible crack in an otherwise polished image. The two men didn't move, but something between them did. A magnetic pull of ideology and ego, faith and fire. Jonathan stepped away from the podium. "We say we serve the same God," he said, pacing slowly, "but we build walls instead of bridges. We shout louder and louder, as if volume could make us holy." His voice shook now, the rhythm of conviction clashing with exhaustion. "You can't shame people into heaven," he said, turning toward Charlie. "And you can't hate your way to salvation." The audience gasped, some in agreement, others in shock. The words had finally crossed from message to confrontation. Charlie leaned forward, gripping his knee, trying to steady his breathing. He wanted to speak, to defend himself, but Jonathan's momentum was relentless. "You call it courage," Jonathan said, voice rising, "but courage without compassion is just cruelty with good lighting." The audience murmured, the tension palpable. Jonathan's hands were trembling. He knew he was losing control, that his words were no longer guided entirely by grace. But he couldn't stop. The truth, or what he thought was truth, was pouring out too fast to contain. Charlie's eyes darkened. "Are you saying I don't love people?" he asked quietly, the microphone amplifying his restraint. "Because that's not fair." Jonathan turned, startled by the directness. "I'm saying," he replied, "that sometimes we confuse influence for impact. We build empires and call them ministries. And maybe I'm guilty too." The crowd froze. That admission landed like a confession no one expected. For a second, both men seemed human again. Two souls caught between conviction and the desperate need to be right. Then came the stillness. The silence thickened, wrapping around every heart in the room. The kind of silence that humbles even the proud. Jonathan stared at the floor, breathing hard, the lights glaring down on him like divine interrogation. His throat burned. He wanted to say more, but there were no words left that didn't feel like weapons. And that's when it happened. A small voice, soft and clear, broke through the air. "Mr. Roumie." The audience turned as one. In the aisle stood a boy, no older than 8, holding a crumpled program in his hand. His face glowed in the light, innocent, unafraid. "Mr. Roumie," he said again, louder this time. Jonathan blinked, confused. "Yes, buddy." The boy hesitated, then pointed toward Charlie. "He's not bad," he said simply. "He's just sad." The words hit like lightning in a cathedral. Cameras froze mid-pan. The crowd gasped as if the entire hall had inhaled at once. Jonathan felt his knees weaken. Charlie's mouth opened, but no sound came out. For a moment, time didn't move. The lights softened, dimming as if heaven itself leaned closer to listen. Jonathan's heart cracked open in his chest. The anger that had fueled him drained away, replaced by something raw and wordless. The boy's gaze never wavered, steady, gentle, impossibly certain. "He prays when no one's looking," the child added. "I saw him." Jonathan felt tears sting his eyes. The crowd shifted in silence, unsure whether to clap or cry. Every camera in the room stayed fixed on that small boy, the one who had just said the truest thing of the night. Charlie looked down, his face breaking for the first time. The practiced calm vanished, replaced by something far more human, grief. Jonathan took a step forward, his voice shaking. "What did you say?" The boy repeated softly, "He's not bad. He's just sad." Jonathan's lip quivered. He dropped the microphone, the sound echoing like thunder in the hall. The moment stretched, sacred and impossible to explain. And in that moment, God spoke through the smallest voice. No one moved. The lights hummed softly, their golden glow turning the stage into something more like a chapel than a debate hall. Jonathan stood frozen, the boy's words still hanging in the air like an unanswered prayer. Charlie sat motionless, eyes glassy, lips parted, his composure shattered by a truth so small it didn't need volume to be powerful. Jonathan's voice cracked first. What do you mean, son?" The boy blinked, his hands clutching that wrinkled program like it was a shield. "I saw him," he said simply. "He was in the back room before it started. He was sitting by the curtain." Charlie's head snapped up, his breath catching. The boy continued, his voice trembling but clear. "He was praying, but he was crying too. Not loud, just little tears, like when you don't want anyone to know. He said, 'Please God, just let me make you proud again.'" The words dropped into the silence like pebbles into deep water, each ripple spreading through every heart in the room. Jonathan's chest tightened, every trace of anger dissolving into ache. His throat felt raw, his hands numb. Charlie lowered his gaze. His hand went to his mouth, fingers pressing against the trembling edge of confession. The boy's innocence didn't accuse, it revealed. There was no judgment in his voice, only compassion pure enough to slice through years of pride. "He's not bad," the child whispered again. "He's just scared that God stopped listening." The room trembled. It wasn't noise, it was the sound of restraint breaking, the invisible walls between performance and pain crumbling under the weight of truth too real to deny. Jonathan stepped forward slowly, one hand out as if approaching something fragile. "Hey, buddy," he said softly, kneeling now, eyes level with the boy. "What's your name?" "Ali," the boy said. "Ali," Jonathan repeated, the name tasting ancient and holy. Do you really think God stopped listening to him?" The boy shook his head. "No, God never stops. But sometimes people stop hearing him. The noise gets too loud." Jonathan's heart broke wide open. That noise, he knew it well. The applause, the debates, the endless striving to sound holy instead of being whole. He felt the weight of every word he'd spoken in anger that night pressing against him, demanding repentance. The audience remained still, faces glistening in the dim light. The cameras, forgotten, continued to roll. Jonathan turned toward Charlie. For the first time, his voice was gentle. "Is that true?" Charlie's breath hitched. "Aye," He couldn't finish. His chest caved inward as he swallowed hard. I don't even know anymore. His voice broke completely. I talk, I preach, I argue, but I don't feel him. Not like I used to. Jonathan nodded slowly, his tears spilling freely now. Neither do I. That confession rippled through the hall like wind through candles. The crowd seemed to exhale all at once, a collective surrender to honesty. Jonathan stood, walked toward Charlie, and for a moment, neither man spoke. Two leaders, two believers, both undone by a child's clarity. Charlie looked up through wet eyes. You were right, he whispered. I got lost in the noise. Jonathan shook his head. No, I was just loud in the wrong direction. Eli watched them quietly, then smiled the way only a child can, unbothered by politics, theology, or pride. You both talk about God a lot, he said, but maybe he just wants you to listen together. That simple sentence tore through Jonathan like scripture. He closed his eyes, inhaling slowly, letting humility wash over him like baptism. He looked at the boy, then at Charlie. He's right, Jonathan murmured. We've been talking at each other, not with him. Charlie nodded, his voice a whisper. Maybe it's time we stop shouting. Jonathan turned toward the audience. The bright light softened, as if the whole room had been caught in a moment too sacred to interrupt. Faces blurred behind tears. The sound of sniffles echoed faintly, breaking the perfect silence. Jonathan stepped back toward the mic, but this time his tone was different, quiet, reverent. Sometimes, he said, the loudest people are the most broken, and sometimes the strongest ones are just trying not to fall apart. He looked at Charlie, then down at Eli, who stood watching them both, eyes wide and unafraid. We think faith is about shouting the truth. Jonathan continued, voice trembling, but maybe faith is about hearing the whisper. The hall was no longer an audience. It was a congregation. The cameras kept rolling, but the show was gone. What was left was human. Charlie's shoulders shook. He covered his face, but the sob escaped anyway. A sound raw and cleansing. Jonathan knelt beside him, placing a trembling hand on his shoulder. It's okay, he whispered. You're not alone. Eli stepped closer, small hands clasped in front of him. My mom says leaders cry too, he said softly, because their hearts have to hold more people. Jonathan's breath caught. He turned to the boy, eyes glistening. Leaders cry too, he repeated, barely more than a whisper. And for the first time that night, it wasn't about victory or vindication. It was about surrender. The applause didn't return. No one stood. They simply sat in that sacred, trembling quiet, the kind of silence where heaven feels near and truth doesn't need a microphone. Somewhere above them, the lights dimmed another shade warmer, wrapping the moment in gold. Jonathan closed his eyes, feeling something inside him heal, not loudly, but completely. Eli smiled once more. See, he said, God was listening the whole time. Jonathan nodded slowly, voice breaking into a tearful laugh. Yeah, kid, he whispered, he really was. The crowd had gone home hours ago, but the echoes of what had happened still lingered in the air. The stage lights dimmed to a warm amber, soft and forgiving. The cameras had been turned off, the microphones silenced. Only two men remained, Jonathan and Charlie, sitting side by side on the edge of the stage, their legs dangling into the darkness. For a long time, neither spoke. The weight of what had transpired pressed against them, not in anger anymore, but in awe. Jonathan broke the silence first. His voice was low, gentle. I didn't expect tonight to end like this. Charlie gave a small laugh, hollow but honest. Neither did I. I thought I was coming here to defend myself, not fall apart. Jonathan smiled faintly, rubbing the bridge of his nose. Maybe falling apart is the point. Sometimes God needs to break us open just to make space for grace again. Charlie stared at the floor, fingers tracing the grooves in the stage wood. You know, he said after a pause, I used to feel peace when I prayed, real peace. Then somewhere along the way it just stopped. His voice cracked on the last word. I still pray every day. but lately it's like I'm talking to a ceiling." Jonathan looked at him, eyes soft with understanding. "I've been there too," he said quietly. "You start out listening, but after a while you get so busy talking for God that you forget to talk to Him." Charlie nodded slowly. "Maybe that's it. Maybe I stopped being quiet long enough to hear anything back." The admission hung between them, sacred and heavy. Jonathan leaned back, exhaling. "God never stopped listening, Charlie. You just stopped being quiet enough to hear." Charlie closed his eyes, tears pooling but not falling. "Do you really believe that?" Jonathan nodded. "I do. Because tonight, he used a child to tell both of us what we were too proud to admit. That he's still here. Still talking. We just needed to shut up long enough to notice." A small laugh escaped from Charlie's throat, a laugh that was half a sob. "You're right," he whispered. "All this time, I kept asking for signs, for miracles, for proof, and he sent an 8-year-old. Jonathan chuckled softly, wiping his eyes. "God's got a sense of humor like that." For a moment, the two men sat in silence again, but this time it wasn't awkward, it was holy. The kind of quiet that felt like prayer even before a word was spoken. Charlie turned to him. "Can we pray?" Jonathan nodded, surprised by how naturally the question came. "Yeah, let's." They both slid from the stage floor onto their knees. No lights, no audience, no applause. Just the creak of wood beneath them and the faint hum of electricity in the rafters. Jonathan closed his eyes, his voice breaking into a whisper. "Father," he began, "thank you for humbling us tonight, for reminding us that your voice doesn't need a microphone. That sometimes the holiest sound in the world is silence." Charlie joined in, his words trembling. "And thank you," he said, "for not giving up on me, even when I stopped listening, for speaking through a child when I couldn't hear you any other way." Their prayers overlapped, not polished, not rehearsed, but raw and real. Jonathan's tears fell freely now, darkening the wood beneath him. Charlie bowed his head, his shoulders shaking as a soft sob escaped. When they finished, they stayed kneeling for a while, breathing in that quiet stillness. It wasn't the stillness of pride anymore, it was the stillness of surrender. Charlie broke the silence. "You know," he whispered, "I thought the message tonight was meant for me." Jonathan smiled weakly, eyes still closed. "Yeah," he said, voice barely audible. "So did I." He opened his eyes, looked at Charlie, and added softly, "But as we prayed, I realized the message that night wasn't for you, it was for me." The lights flickered slightly, a faint golden glow washing over them like dawn. Outside, the city was quiet, unaware that two men on a darkened stage had just found peace again, not in words, but in silence. Months passed, but that night never left me. It lingered in the quiet moments, in the hush before prayer, in the pause between words. Everywhere I went, people whispered about the boy. At first, it was just a story shared online. Then it became a movement. They started calling it the Little Voice Movement. Not because anyone planned it, but because something inside people woke up. The same way it had woken in me that night. I began receiving letters by the hundreds. Handwritten, tear-stained, trembling with honesty. A mother wrote, "My daughter watched the video and said, 'Mom, maybe God still talks. We just forgot to listen.' That night, we prayed together for the first time in years." A soldier wrote from overseas, "I used to pray out of fear. Now I pray out of peace. Because if God can speak through a child, maybe he can still speak through me." Each story felt like a heartbeat, echoing the same truth: God still talks. And slowly the noise of the world, the outrage, the debates, the pride, started to sound smaller against the whisper of something greater. Churches began holding Little Voice Sundays. No loud music. No lights. Just families sitting in circles, sharing when they last heard God whisper. One father stood up, voice shaking. "I realized I've been talking at my son, not listening to him. Tonight I heard God say, 'Start listening.'" The crowd didn't clap. They didn't have to. Tears said enough. I traveled from city to city, but I wasn't preaching anymore. I was listening. To strangers, to skeptics, to children. Everywhere I went, I asked the same question. What's the smallest voice that changed your life? And the answers poured in. A firefighter told me, after hearing your story, I started praying with my team before every shift. Not because it's tradition, because it's truth. We realize courage doesn't come from noise. It comes from stillness. A teacher from Arizona said, I began every class with 1 minute of silence. At first, the kids giggled. Now, they bow their heads. Some pray. Some just breathe. But something holy happens in that minute. A nurse in Chicago wrote, "A patient coded" in front of me. I froze, and then I remembered your words. God still talks. I prayed under my breath, and somehow I knew what to do next. He lived. Every letter carried the same pulse. Not fame, not spectacle, just revival. And it didn't start with a celebrity. It started with a child, 8 years old, trembling honest. That became my message everywhere I went. Don't underestimate the small voice. Don't overlook the quiet moment, because God doesn't need a stage. He just needs your attention. Soon, people began forming groups, not organizations, not movements for money or fame, just small gatherings in coffee shops, living rooms, backyards. They'd light a candle, pray, and share the little voices they'd heard that week. One woman stood in Kansas City and said, "My daughter told me, Mom, maybe God isn't quiet, maybe we're just loud." And I haven't stopped thinking about that since. In another town, a young man shared, I stopped praying for God to fix my problems. I started praying for Him to fix my heart. It was spreading, not like wildfire, but like morning light, soft, steady, unstoppable. I remember one evening, I stood on a small church stage in North Carolina. There was no band, no spotlight. Just people sitting shoulder to shoulder, their faces glowing in candlelight. I told them, the world doesn't need louder voices. It needs softer hearts. And they listened, not with applause, but with tears. That's when I realized revival doesn't start in stadiums. It starts in hearts willing to listen. As the weeks turned to months, the movement reached places I never imagined. In Brazil, children painted murals of open ears with the words, "Dis ainda fala." In Kenya, a pastor wrote to me saying, "Your story reminded us that even in chaos, God whispers." And in a small village in the Philippines, they held a service under the stars, no sound system, no sermon, just silence and gratitude. Everywhere the same phrase echoed, God still talks. It became more than a message. It became a rhythm, a prayer, a revolution of quiet. I carried a copy of the boy's drawing with me everywhere. The crooked heart, the uneven letters. God still talks. You just have to stop yelling long enough to hear Him. It was wrinkled now, soft from the folds, but sacred as Scripture. Whenever I felt tired or doubted that it mattered, I'd unfold it, and the memory would rush back. His voice, trembling but true. And sometimes I'd whisper to myself, He wasn't just talking to Charlie that night. He was talking to all of us. One evening, I sat in a chapel alone, the air thick with incense and quiet. My phone buzzed with notifications, messages, interviews, all wanting the same story. But I didn't answer. Instead, I looked up at the cross and said aloud, Lord, don't let me become noise again. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was alive. And in it, I heard it again, the same whisper that started everything. Be still. That's when it hit me. Maybe God's been speaking all along. Maybe the only reason we stopped hearing Him is because we filled every space with our own voices. And if a single boy could silence a room full of cameras and egos, what could happen if the whole world listened again? What if that's how healing begins? Not with shouting, but with stillness. What if that's how revival truly starts? With a whisper. I didn't know then how far this story would reach. I didn't know there'd be a book, or a movement, or letters from every corner of the globe. All I knew was that the flame had spread, quiet, unseen, divine. People weren't looking for perfection anymore. They were looking for peace. and every time someone told me their little voice story, I'd nod and think, this is what it looks like when heaven speaks softly. The world was still noisy, but now there was a new sound rising beneath it. Not anger, not outrage, but a chorus of listening hearts. I thought back to that boy, his small hand raised, his trembling words that disarmed pride and melted walls. And one evening, after a year of traveling, sharing, listening, I felt that same pull again. Something inside me said, go back. Back to where it started, so I did. I returned to that same community center. The walls had been repainted, the stage polished, but the air felt familiar, holy even. Outside, I saw volunteers setting up tables for a children's outreach event. And then I froze. There, sitting on the steps, sketching in a notebook, was a little boy. Dark hair, calm focus, same stillness. My breath caught in my throat. Then one day I saw him again. He was sitting cross-legged on the concrete steps, the afternoon sun catching his hair like a halo. A box of crayons beside him, a scrap of paper in his lap. The hum of chatter and laughter surrounded us. Volunteers setting up tables, children running with balloons. But somehow, the world went quiet again, just like that night. For a moment I couldn't move. My chest tightened with something between awe and disbelief. The same small shoulders, the same calm that didn't belong to his years. He looked up, squinting into the sunlight, and then he smiled. Hi, Mr. Roumie. I exhaled a laugh that came out half as a sigh. You remember me? He nodded, matter of fact, as if I'd just stepped off stage from a moment ago instead of months past. You were sad that night. But not anymore. I swallowed hard. You could tell? He shrugged, his voice soft but certain. People who are sad talk loud. People who are happy listen more. That sentence landed like scripture. I sat beside him, careful not to disturb the crayons scattered like tiny stained glass windows across the step. The sunlight filtered through the trees, painting us in gold and green. What are you drawing? I asked. He turned the paper toward me. Two stick figures knelt side by side under a beam of yellow light. Above them, in wobbly letters, he'd written "Good job for listening." My throat tightened. I started, but couldn't finish. He grinned. That's you and Mr. Charlie. I stared at the drawing, the crude lines, the crooked hearts above our heads, and felt something holy stir in the simplest of forms. Where did you learn to draw like that? He didn't look up. God tells me what to make. He said you'd come back. The words hit like a whisper from heaven. I blinked against the sudden sting in my eyes. He did. He nodded again, focused on adding streaks of blue. He said you were listening again. That's good. For a long while, I didn't speak. We just sat there, the silence filled with the sound of crayons moving and laughter in the distance. Finally, I asked, do you still think Charlie's sad? He paused mid-draw, thinking deeply in that way only children can. Unhurried, pure. Not sad anymore. Just quiet. That's better. I smiled. Yeah, I whispered. That's better. He looked up, his expression suddenly serious. Do you think God talks to me? My voice cracked before I could answer. He already did. His face lit up, radiant and innocent. Then maybe I'll tell him you said hi. I laughed, the sound soft, trembling. Yeah, please do. The boy went back to coloring. I watched him, his small hands moving with focus, his brow furrowed like a prophet translating a vision. Around us, the world continued, volunteers handing out snacks, music playing from a cheap speaker, children chasing bubbles. And yet, there was something unmistakably sacred about that moment. The sunlight slipped through the clouds, falling across his paper like a benediction. He squinted at it, then leaned closer, adding the final touches to his drawing. When he finished, he held it up proudly. Do you like it? I took it in my hands carefully, as if it might dissolve in the light. Two men kneeling, a golden beam between them. Above it, the same words he had written months ago, only now outlined in red crayon, God still talks. He smiled shyly and whispered the rest. You just have to stop yelling long enough to hear him. The air left my lungs. That same phrase, his words, unchanged, but somehow heavier now, more complete. It wasn't just a reminder. It was a revelation. I looked at him, this small messenger who spoke like heaven disguised in denim and dust. Do you know what those words have done? I asked. He tilted his head. What do you mean? They've changed people. Thousands, maybe millions. You started something, kiddo? He shook his head, smudging a bit of yellow light with his thumb. I didn't start anything. God just needed someone small enough to fit between all the noise. That line hit deeper than any sermon I'd ever given. He packed his crayons, humming softly. I have to go, he said. Mom says we're planting trees today. Of course, I managed, still staring at the drawing in my hands. He started to walk away, then turned back one last time. Mr. Roumie. He smiled. Don't stop listening, okay? I nodded, voice thick with emotion. I won't. I promise. He grinned wider, then waved, that small, effortless motion, and ran off toward the laughter and the sunlight. I stayed there long after he disappeared, the noise of the event fading into a gentle hum. The drawing trembled in my hands as the wind passed through. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I needed to say anything. I didn't need to preach, to explain, to prove. I just needed to listen. The sky was wide, the air bright and clear, and somewhere beyond the sound of children playing, I thought I heard it again. That quiet, unmistakable whisper. Be still. And I knew the story wasn't over. It never would be. Because as long as there were hearts willing to listen, as long as there were little voices brave enough to speak, God would keep talking. And maybe, just maybe, the world would start to listen back. I keep his drawing folded inside my Bible, right beside Matthew 18:93. Unless you become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. The paper is soft now, the crayon lines faded at the edges, but every time I open to that page, I see the beam of light between two men and remember the voice that started everything. The boy's words became more than a memory. They became a compass, a call to quiet. Everywhere I travel now, small churches, crowded cities, open fields, I tell the same story. Not about celebrity or confrontation or debate, but about a single, trembling voice that reminded us what faith really sounds like. And people listen, not with applause, but with stillness. I tell them, the world doesn't need louder preachers. It needs softer hearts. And when I say it, something in the room always shifts. A silence falls that feels alive, not empty. Because they know, deep down they know, we've all been talking too much. The little voice movement has spread beyond anything I could have imagined. There are no logos, no hashtags, no sponsors. Just people choosing to listen again. A farmer in Iowa who begins each morning in prayerful silence. A teenager in Seoul who sits by her window each night, asking God to speak through her dreams. A family in Cairo who ends dinner with a minute of quiet gratitude instead of rushing to screens. It's not revival in the way people used to describe it, with shouting and fire and spectacle. It's revival in whispers, in forgiveness, in pauses between words. And everywhere I go, I tell them about the boy, about how he looked at the noise of adults, the pride, the anger, the arguing, and somehow saw through it to the sadness beneath. How he said what no one else could. He's not bad, he's just sad. Those words still echo in me. Because maybe that's what we all are, not bad, just lost beneath the volume of our own fear. When people ask me what the movement means, I tell them it's not about religion or denomination. It's about returning. Returning to the kind of faith that listens before it speaks, that loves before it judges, that prays before it posts. Faith in the quiet, that's what the boy taught me. Sometimes, before I step on stage now, I touch that folded drawing in my Bible and whisper a prayer, Lord, don't let me become noise again. And somehow, every time, the world slows down, the lights dim, the murmurs hush, and I feel that same warmth, that same sacred stillness that filled the room the night it all began. I've learned that the voice of God doesn't compete with our chaos. He doesn't shout above the noise, he waits beneath it. And when we finally stop, when we surrender the urge to be right, to be heard, to be seen, that's when we hear him, through the laughter of a child, through the forgiveness in an embrace, through the quiet moment between heartbeats, when we realize we're not alone. And maybe that's the whole lesson. God never stopped talking. We just stopped listening. The boy's drawing has become a symbol now, printed on cards, etched in stained glass, drawn by children in Sunday schools around the world. Two figures kneeling under a beam of light. Above them, those same uneven letters, good job for listening. It's simple. It's imperfect. It's divine. And sometimes I wonder, if a single child could wake up the world, what's stopping the rest of us? Maybe faith isn't about finding your voice at all. Maybe it's about finding the courage to quiet it. Because in the stillness, in the humility, in the soft places where pride finally falls silent, that's where heaven speaks. And if you listen closely enough, you might just hear it too, a whisper cutting through the noise, saying, "Be still, I'm still here." The screen fades from light to soft shadows, images of faces, families, and folded hands. A father holding his son close, a nurse praying in a hospital corridor, a classroom full of children, eyes closed, breathing in silence before the day begins. My voice returns, quiet but steady. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. The world is still shouting, still fighting to be heard, but maybe what we need now isn't another voice screaming for attention. Maybe what we need is you. The montage slows. Candlelight flickers, a woman forgives her sister, a soldier bows his head before dawn. Be the little voice in someone's storm. Be the calm in their chaos. Be the reminder that grace still speaks. The music swells gently, piano and strings rising like a heartbeat, because when the world shouts for attention, truth whispers through love, and that whisper can heal more than 1,000 arguments ever could. A shot of the crayon drawing fills the screen. Two figures under a beam of yellow light. The words read, "God still talks." You just have to stop yelling long enough to hear him. My voice softens to a near prayer. If a child can wake up the world, what's stopping us? The movement doesn't belong to me. It belongs to every heart willing to listen. The music fades to a single piano note lingering. So if you believe that faith begins where the noise ends, then don't just watch. Join us. Share this story. Subscribe. Spread the whisper. A final pause. And when you do, remember, the smallest voices can carry the loudest truth. Fade to black. The little voice movement. Be still and begin.